Mm.
So I ask you to join me in working long hours, nights, and weekends, if necessary, to pass this bill. And I don't make that request lightly. For from the window where I sit the problems of our country, I recognize that from outside this chamber is the outraged conscience of a nation, the grave concern of many nations, and the harsh judgment of history on our acts. But even if we pass this bill, the battle will not be over. What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. And there it is, Lyndon Johnson, right there, his first major, speech to the nation as the president of the United States post Kennedy, and on the brink of launching into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Great Society.
Which is exactly what we're going to talk about here tonight.
If anything, you're good at setting up a segue.
That's it. I know. If there's anything we're good at, it's foreshadowing and really bad jokes. Pretty good at that.
We've got that, puns, isms, and we've got Johnson quotes.
That's true, and not just about Johnson's only. We do what we can. I was actually looking in when because we decided to do this little. I don't know. Are we calling it a full series, mini series? What are we?
I think it's full series. I mean, if it was a mini series, these episodes would be 30 minutes, but each of them have been an hour. So
that's a good point, and I guess that's partially our fault. We talk a lot.
It's actually Lyndon Johnson's fault for being interesting and complex.
Yeah,
and for the topic area. I mean, professional yapper. There it is. That's your title, buddy.
It is.
Forever.
Looking into this, I was actually looking into the election of 1964. Of course, that puts our topic of discussion tonight, Mr. Lyndon Johnson, against an Arizona senator, Mr. Barry Goldwater. And not only is he an Arizona senator, he's also a major general in the United States Air Force Reserves. Now, interestingly enough, before we actually started talking on this show about, or on this particular episode tonight, we were actually talking about the Daisy ad, which if you haven't seen that, I encourage our listeners to go on YouTube after watching this, of course. Go to YouTube and look up the Daisy ad.
You don't have to go to YouTube. They're already there.
That's true. Just, I guess, open up a new area of YouTube. Check it out. And they say that politics is just now being explosive. It's like, well, maybe not. Maybe not.
It's been a while. So what are we talking tonight? Because we're not just talking Lyndon Johnson, right? And we did Vietnam.
Yep.
So now what are we doing?
So I know that we focus a little bit on his international politics, which were not Johnson's strong suit, mind you. Johnson was arguably destined to be a domestic president because there is something that Johnson does sort of coin. He's actually giving a commencement address to the University of Michigan, to the spring graduating class of 1964. Lincoln, listen to me, Johnson. Lincoln Johnson, one of those. Lyndon Johnson called upon the American nation to move upward to what he called the Great Society. And, we cannot talk Lyndon Johnson. If we're going to do a full series on Mr. Johnson here, we cannot go without his domestic program that he called the Great Society.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think one of the hallmarks of the Great Society, we were talking like, what's the most important thing that he did? Is it Medicare? Is it Medicaid? I'm of the camp that it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 65, something that, Johnson himself had voted against a civil rights bill when he was in the legislative body, and here he is as the chief executive talking to his old colleagues in the Senate, telling them, "Fine, I don't care if you filibuster it, just don't vote."
So what do you? I guess, does that make Johnson a hypocrite, or is that one of those things where, as you get older, you get wiser, and you're supposed to change your opinions?
Well, fortunately, John Meacham gives us a nice little way to answer that question, because you know me, I've been reading about this pretty much nonstop. Do you think our readers want me to read the entire book to them? We could do audiobooks for free. A free audiobook. It's just books that I like. So
right, yeah, that's a good point. It's books
I have a lot of time on my hands. So anyhow, Johnson had hardly been a progressive in his pre-White House years. A Texan with an astute sense of politics and a consuming ambition, he had erred on the side of appeasing his segregationist constituents. While he had declined, along with other Tennessee senators, Albert Gore Sr. and Estes Kefauver, to sign the 1956 Southern Manifesto, a declaration pledging resistance to Warren Court's groundbreaking school integration decisions, Johnson had also weakened the Civil Rights Bill in the Senate, though he would point out that at least it passed in some form. His commitment to the cause after Dallas forms one of the great chapters of personal transformation and of political courage in the history of the presidency, one akin to Lincoln's move from tolerance of slavery in 1861 to emancipation in 1863. "I've never felt freer in all my life," LBJ remarked in January 1964. In the story of Johnson and civil rights, we can see see the difference a singular president can make when the circumstances are right and the voices of protest are steady and brave. It's a personal transformation for him, though.
Well,
he even says it himself. I mean, I stopped reading that speech, but he says, right after he says, "And we shall overcome," he says, "As a man whose roots go deeply into Southern soil, I know how agonizing racial feelings are. I know how difficult it is to reshape attitudes and the structure of our society. But a century has passed, more than 100 years since the Negro was freed, and he is not fully free tonight. It is more than 100 years ago that Abraham Lincoln, a great president of another party, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but emancipation is a proclamation and not a fact. A century has passed, more than 100 years since equality was promised, and the Negro is not yet equal. A century has passed since the day of promise, and the promise is unkept. The time of justice has now come."
Yeah.
And he is in the middle of this incredible kind of transformation. There's a great kind of accounting within John Meacham's The Soul of America book, where I just quoted that from. But he's talking about Title II of the Civil Rights Bill when Johnson was still in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll read the exchange. Johnson said, "How do you like that Title II of the Civil Rights Bill, John?" This is John Stennis of Mississippi. And Stennis responded, "Oh, Lyndon, well, our people just can't take that kind of thing. It's just impossible. I mean, I believe a man ought to have a right to, if he owns a store, if he owns a cafe, he ought to have a right to serve whom he wants to serve. Our people will just never take it." Johnson said, "Then you don't think that you'll support it?" "No, Lyndon, I don't think I will support it at all." Johnson responded, "Well, John, the other day a sad thing happened. Helen Williams and her husband, Gene, who are African American and have been working for me for many years, drove my official car from Washington down to Texas, the Cadillac limousine of the Vice President of the United States. They drove through your state, and when they got hungry, they stopped at grocery stores on the edge of town in colored areas and brought Vienna sausages and beans and ate them with a plastic spoon. And when they had to go to the bathroom, they would stop, pull off the side of the road, and Helen Williams, an employee of the Vice President of the United States, would squat in the road and pee. And John, that's just bad. That's wrong. And there ought to be something to change that. And it seemed to me that if people in Mississippi don't change it voluntarily, then it's just going to be necessary to change it by law." "Well, Lyndon, I'm sure there are nice places where," then the vice president simply cut him off and said, and he looked away vacantly. "Well, thank you, John." And Stennis left. Johnson turned around to me and winked. And it represented for me, I think, the first time that I had ever really seen the feeling that the comprehension of signal indignity of discrimination was deep in Johnson. And that comes from a Democratic aide within the White House during the vice presidential years. But it is interesting to see Johnson, Texan, right? Walks around hiking up his pants by the belt buckle, calling Brooks Brothers to tell him to give him a little bit more space for his bunghole. And
That's true.
here he is, the vice president of the United States, trying to carry on this idea of bringing equality, finally, bringing a Civil Rights Act before the United States Senate. And it is ultimately signed into law in 1964. And that actually is the picture that's in our backdrop today. You can just barely make out the nose of Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Bill. And I think through the picture, I don't know who's right behind him, but I know just behind him in the actual picture itself is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was there, received one of the pens, saw him sign it, all these things. And that's a very strange relationship between those two men,
Yeah.
Johnson and King, because it's almost at certain times where it's like, all right, Johnson just says, all right, I understand, I get it now just leave me alone, let me do my work as the president of the United States. And King has to tell him, like, I'm not done, we have more work to do. So then along comes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But Johnson does so much more than just civil rights. But I think that comes to be the thing that defines the presidency is the Civil Rights Act of 64. And if it just stopped, if his presidency stopped, that would be what he would be remembered for. Because that's the thing we were talking about in the last episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you put your thumb over Vietnam, it's an incredible legacy. If you put your thumb over everything else, it's the worst presidency that you could have, save for maybe James Buchanan and one other guy.
Yeah, right. No, and you're absolutely correct. And honestly, I don't. I see a lot of people who remember Johnson for the Great Society, but of course he does a lot more than just the Civil Rights Act. But what's incredibly interesting is that in the election of 1964, Johnson, it's a landslide. Election. Barry Goldwater carries 6 states, like Louisiana. I think it's Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Arizona. I think.
Yeah.
It's not many.
What's crazy is those are states that traditionally vote for Democrats,
right?
That voted for a Republican because it wasn't Johnson.
Right?
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, Johnson. But Johnson's defining legacy is his ability to forge coalitions with moderate Republicans and to convince certain deep South Democrats to vote for this massive presidential defining legislation.
And he courts more liberal and more progressive Democrats too.
Yeah.
Because he kind of has, like, he shows his progressive feathers, but he only does it when he has to.
Right.
He does it for this. He does it for Medicare. He does it for Medicaid. Right. He does it for revamping Social Security. Right. He kind of shows the liberal feathers, the progressive feathers when he wants to, and then when he's ready, he rolls out this kind of on. The only person I can compare it to is Lincoln, right? Where he starts with the wedge, and as Frederick Douglass says, then the whole rail comes in behind it.
Yeah.
Johnson starts with a wedge, and that's usually the Johnson treatment, where you're getting talked down to like this the whole time, and he's telling you about a time he was out in the Texas highway, and then all of a sudden you're agreeing with him with everything he's saying. Yes, sir, Mr. President. Yeah. I'll take that right back to the Senate right now. I think in writing on the riot and writing all the stuff that I've done about that and kind of getting into the epilogue chapter, one of the things that just became so apparent to me is Johnson's way of forcing the issue with people. And for better, for worse, right there, he has this innate ability, and we see it throughout his entire presidency. He has this ability to bring people to him, but as long as he can have an intimate conversation with people, it works. And I think, we didn't talk about this in the Vietnam episode, but one of the reasons that Vietnam gets so out of hand is he can't just sit down with Ho Chi Minh and say, well, look, if we were down in Texas, here's what I would do.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't have that ability. So he loses that, right?
Mm.
Civil rights, he's got it. He's got it because he can bring people to the table, even if it's people who vehemently disagree with him. And, Johnson gets right to it. I was looking for this because this is what I wrote about. I wrote about Johnson. Johnson nominates in 1967, June 1967, nominates Thurgood Marshall to sit on the United States Supreme Court as the first African American associate justice to sit on the court. And that's, coincidentally 110 years after the Dred Scott decision. It's 3 years since the Civil Rights Act. It's 2 years since the Voting Rights Act. You can largely see this as how Reconstruction kind of comes to an end, whatever, however the case goes. But Johnson goes to just about every single senator sitting in the chamber, and if they're against the nomination, he chases them down and figures out what he can do with them and how to talk to them. But here he goes. Johnson made every deal possible with Southern segregationist senators to ensure that they would either abstain from the vote or vote that they would be absent. In the end, and this I think should show you the presidential power that he had in 1967, right? In the end, the Senate voted to confirm Marshall in a 69-11 vote. Eastland, Irvin, and Strom Thurmond, unsurprisingly, all voted nay. Johnson convinced his fellow Democrats, including Virginia's Harry Byrd, Georgia's Richard Russell, Benjamin Jordan of North Carolina, as well as the committee's own Smathers and McClellan of Arkansas, not to vote. In the eyes of their constituents, they could simply be seen as defenders of Jim Crow, but not alienate their party or their president. And so it was on August 30th, 1967, that Thurgood Marshall was was confirmed by the United States Senate to take his seat on the Supreme Court. That's the power that Johnson has. Now, that doesn't mean that he's perfect, right? Because we've talked about this. He's incredibly flawed when it comes to race and understanding, but it's one of those things where he's evolving over time. And there is a great passage in this book by Joshua Zeitz where he talked about how if at any point someone wanted to use this history to divide us, they could use it to divide. I mean, people would always twist the narrative.
Yeah.
Johnson, if it was anti-war rhetoric, if it was just anti-Democrat rhetoric, because eventually Johnson becomes the archetypal, Democrat, socialist with a small s, communist with a small c in the eyes of later Republicans who see him as kind of the Antichrist. And Great Society gets lumped in with the New Deal as like socialism light, even though these are things that helped people. So what else? We've talked about civil rights. We've talked, Johnson's complicated issues on race and status on race. But what else?
Although, yes, I think, Johnson is definitely hailed as a cornerstone president, especially in the modern, Democratic Party, and he has, every president has a reason to have praise. Some have more than others. But it's also easy to lambast presidents, as we should. We shouldn't be.
That's what we said in the last episode. Is every president's got one thing you can criticize.
Yeah, and the thing is that we don't, as American citizens, we don't worship the ground that any politician should walk on, and to make it your personality is just ridiculous. It's almost anti-American to say the least. But let's kind of take a moment just to take a look at what the Great Society looks like. So the Great Society has, and I've kind of boiled it down to about 6 major goals, which I kind of want us to discuss a little bit because I have a particular opinion on it that you may or may not share here. So goal number 1 is to bring aid to underprivileged Americans.
Yep.
Pretty straightforward. Johnson also wants to regulate the nation's resources. So you'll see every now and again the four-way split political spectrum.
Yeah.
I just see Johnson in the background covering all four quadrants.
With his
Yeah, the thing is so he's democratic socialist. He wants to bring aid to the underprivileged Americans. Oh, but he wants to regulate natural resources. He wants to protect American consumers. So he's capitalist. It's like he's everywhere. He's all of the things. He wants to do land conservation, immigration reform, and probably one of the most unsung things about the Great Society is that he wanted to put money in for the arts and humanities. What a shock that must be, because God knows we're lacking that. But of course, Johnson's programs, they put a lot of money into colleges, elementary schools, secondary educations, things of that general nature. And it provided, of course, remedial services for, poor districts, lower income families, etc. But probably one of the, because Johnson, like you said, he has a knack for pizzazz, for panache, and to kind of strike the point home is that Johnson he signs this education funding bill, actually in that one-room schoolhouse that he went to as a kid there in Stonewall, Texas. So that was kind of cool that he signs education legislation in the one-room schoolhouse that he went to as a kid.
I think shows how impactful that period of his life was.
Of course it is.
Not only just where he went to school, but then also think about his early career. He's a teacher.
Yeah.
He sees, impoverished Latino students. He sees impoverished white students. Everybody's suffering the same way, and they all need help.
Yeah.
And it's just you don't want to get this to where it sounds like an overcorrection, like we're lauding everything that Johnson did, because again, complex individual with a lot of baggage that he carries along, because there is a little strain kind of narcissism that exists within Johnson, because he sees all of these things as a transaction.
Yeah.
This is how he sees, not only does he want to help, right? He does, I think, in his heart, right? That's where he wants to go. But he also sees this very transactionally. And, I think the Great Society, this is a great way for us to end the presidency discussion, because the next episode that we're going to do, surprise, we couldn't do it in just 3 episodes. We're going to do 4. We've got a guest coming on to talk about how Johnson's been remembered. But the end of his presidency, really, everything starts to fall apart in 1968. We've got, after basically 4 years, a very much maligned, very changed, but still very powerful and impactful civil rights leader in Martin Luther King Jr. He's killed. And then Bobby Kennedy, Johnson's political rival and adversary, and I would say nemesis, is killed. But as Johnson goes to sleep at night at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, out his windows, he can hear the anti-war protesters shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" He can't go anywhere without being attacked or kind of been thronged at. This is a man who in 1968 keeps saying, well, I gave them everything they could want, right? He says, I gave African Americans, I gave them the Civil Rights Act, I gave them the Voting Rights Act. Why aren't they supporting me? I gave the children, I gave them higher education. Why aren't they supporting me? I've given everybody Social Security. I've given people Medicare. I've given people Medicaid. Why aren't they supporting me? He sees this as, I gave to you. Why aren't you giving back to me? And that's something that I picked up in reading Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Johnson. Is everything in his life had always been transactional. His relationship between his mother and his upbringing, everything was transactional. So then now as the president, that's something he goes to the White House with, because at the end of the day, he might be the president of the United States, but he's a normal person just like you and me.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And Johnson's one of those individuals that it's at the heart of hearts, that he is setting out to do the most good by the most amount of people. And one of the ways that he shows that, in the Great Society is, before Obamacare, there was Medicare, there was Medicaid, because Johnson realizes, health insurance is, a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, there are
This
Americans
is
with no access to healthcare to
And this is the 1960s. This isn't 2024 and the whole, Luigi Mangione thing. Wild. The Mario brothers are at it again, trying to bring, medical justice to the American people. Lyndon Johnson would like a word.
Yeah, it's a very, very I think that's one of those things where you can tell that's just where his heart is.
Yeah.
That's that legacy of the New Deal. That's that FDR idea of extending a helping hand because the government is here to help people.
Yeah.
And
it's his, I don't know. I get it, and you want to be, I don't know, you want to be optimistic about certain things, but his war on poverty, is it feasible? Can you actually ever defeat poverty?
Here's this is the worst comparison I can tell you, right? Worst analogy I can give you. There's a comic book. Right? This starts there. All right. Hold on to your seats. It's by Alex Ross, who is arguably one of the greatest animators in the comic world, right? His work with Paul Dini and Kingdom Come Superman, just spectacular, right? He did one on it's Batman War on Crime, but it's Superman Peace on Earth. And it's Superman wants to end poverty, wants to end world hunger. And basically, the 20 some odd pages, you realize that, yep, he's Superman, but even he can't end world hunger. And he basically ends it by saying, if we're going to do this, we all have to change, which is arguably the most disappointing comic book ever because you want Superman to be the guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so watch as I weave this together. Superman, Lyndon Johnson. I'm not saying they're the same person. I'm just saying I've never seen them in the same room at the same time.
I'm just saying they've crossed paths.
But it's how can you possibly expect your presidency to accomplish this? I mean, this thing that has been around really since the very beginning of time, since the beginning of the country, since the beginning of really civilization, is that there are always people that are left on the outside. They're always left on the fringes to try and scrounge and gather up whatever they can to sustain themselves. It's an impossible ask.
Yeah.
But isn't it worth it? Isn't it worth a punt? Is it worth a try for Johnson to say, we'll try and find ways that the government can help?
Yeah, I mean,
some ways to make this thing.
Yeah, and in the same way, in the same vein, FDR is probably thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
What his presidency was offering was something completely and totally brand new to the American people.
Yeah.
And, just because it never been tried before doesn't mean it can't work. And I guess that's Johnson's thought process too, is that, it just might.
Yeah.
Who knows?
And FDR even said that I can't remember if it was the first inaugural, but he basically said, he's like, I promise I'll be a president that will try.
I think that was his first inaugural, yeah.
Yeah. And Johnson essentially takes up the same kind of mantle because the one thing that we've forgotten in all of this is that he inherits the new frontier too.
Yeah.
Right. So he doesn't get Camelot. That goes to Bobby Kennedy. But from JFK, he inherits the new frontier, which is this idea that America is going to lead the way forward. Well, how can you lead the way forward with people clamoring in the streets and undereducated and underfed and nourished children and a wrecked economy post World War II, post Korea? How do you rebound from that? Yeah. And Kennedy paves the way, and Eisenhower and Kennedy paved the way. But this whole idea, this new frontier, that goes straight to the mindset for a guy like Johnson to make it his own. So you take little pieces here and there, right? We'll lead the way. We'll become this. We'll become that. And you thread it together into your new idea of the Great Society.
Right. And one of the things that Johnson's specifically looking to fix is especially the growing disparity in poverty rates amongst kids
Yeah.
in the United States. And the Johnson presidency, made note that in 1950 there were about a little over 1.5 million kids who were on welfare of some kind by the American government. And just 10 years later, just a decade later, in 1960, during the first portion of Kennedy's term, is that number increases to 2.4 million Americans, and that's probably the most distressing, statistic, at least on behalf of the Johnson presidency. And of course, these numbered statistics, there's a lot of explanations for that, and one of those is a lot of racial discrepancies that can explain some of those numbers. Because in 1960, black unemployment, just of black youth, is somewhere around 25%, despite just 20 years ago being around 8%. And there's a variety of explanations, for this. Neither one of us are economists, nor do we care or have time to explain any of that. But nonetheless, those are the numbers here. And of course, Kennedy wants to enact some sort of legislation, if you will, or create some sort of commission that would kind of handle a domestic program to alleviate economic strife of some of your lower income families. But of course, it never comes to Kennedy's fruition, of course, because of his assassination. And Johnson, of course, takes the lead of his predecessor. But of course, when Johnson kind of ushers in this war on poverty, if you will, he does have a couple of things that cause him to experience a level of controversy even in his own administration.
Mm-hmm.
And probably one of the worst outcomes of these, this one particular policy that Lyndon Johnson and his administration had brought in with this war on poverty was the creation of what they called community action agencies, or CAAs. So these were created about 6 months after Kennedy's assassination, and they're basically individual versions of this federal program, which were established in each city and county and parish all throughout the nation. And their job there was to basically assist and coordinate with federal and state programs, particularly to assist economic strife amongst lower income classes. But the problem is that the power of the CAAs it's debatable of where that power actually is, because there are local political activists that want control of these CAAs, but there's a lot of local ingrained politicians who also want control of these CAAs, which leave a lot of areas of controversy, because you have the rise of some local politicians who become incredibly wealthy off of funds that were meant for lower class people.
Yeah. And I think too, as we kind of wrap up our sort of our look at Johnson on the domestic side, I have a list prepared here. Here's what Johnson accomplished in his tenure as the president, just in the domestic realm. And I want you to think about working with a very, very, very divided House and Senate, particularly in the last 2 years of his presidency. All right, Here we go. You ready? Not only did he sign the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he also signed in 1964 the Economic Opportunity Act, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity, aimed to help attack the roots of American poverty. It starts the Job Corps. He also creates Head Start for pre-K students. So that's a benefit that you and I think we both talked about, how we both become kind of products of Head Start. Creates VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America, peacetime Peace Corps, basically, and in domestic Peace Corps. Then, ready? The Wilderness Protection Act, which saved 9.1 million acres of forest land and industrial development from industrial development. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provided funding for American public schools. The Voting Rights Act, which banned the literacy test. Medicare was created to offset the cost of health care. The National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, was used to fund public money to fund artists and galleries, the Immigration Act to end discriminatory quotas based on ethnic origin, an Omnibus Housing Act, which provided funds to construct low-income housing, and Congress tightened pollution controls with stronger air quality acts. Standards then were raised for all of the safety of the consumer-based products.
Yeah.
Then along comes
Yeah.
to throw all that in the garbage.
Yeah. And
there's a great, I mean, go ahead. I was going
to. I was just going to kind of drive home this point too, is that Johnson really does want this great society to work, but even in itself, it's kind of funny in a way, because Johnson, his presidency he is allotting for about $1 billion annually to be spent towards these great society programs. But annually, the United States was spending about, give or take, $50 billion annually to Vietnam. So it's like, of course, they don't work.
Right.
There goes a significant portion of your budget.
Which makes you think, sometimes when he said he just wanted to get out of Vietnam and be done with it.
Yeah.
It makes you think he really did want to do that too.
Yeah.
You could have all that money. He could have all the defense budget. He had everything that he could ever want to build a great society, but he's trapped by Vietnam by his own choosing.
Yep.
So then that brings up the question. I've been thinking about this for the last couple of days. Does he hamstring himself?
A little bit.
Does he make it to where he can't possibly be remembered as a domestic president because he roils himself so deeply in Vietnam?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's kind of hard not to say that.
Which then I think makes him a tragic figure.
Yeah.
Right? He becomes this kind of almost classical figure in a way, right? He becomes an ancient Greek or Roman. This sort of tragedy plays out for him.
Yeah. And to have these, massive goals to end racial injustice forever, to end poverty forever.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things though that like politicians are going to say, right? Because if you eat left or right, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, if you say, to hell with them kids, I don't support the troops.
Push Granny down a flight of stairs.
Yeah,
nobody's going to vote for you.
No one's going to vote for you.
This is the thing. I don't think those people mean it when they say it.
That was my point. Is I think the difference between your atypical politician and Lyndon Johnson is that he actually kind of was looking to mean it, but didn't have the means to do it.
Yeah, but sometimes by his own choosing.
Yeah.
Which I think is that's the sad part, right? He wanted to be remembered as a domestic president, and he almost undid himself, which is a tragedy all on its own.
Yeah.
For him, but for the people who received aid from these programs. And then really, what's the longevity of great society? There's some things that are still around, right? But they've been weakened, they've been gutted, the programs have been redesigned, or they've been so bureaucratized.
Yeah. They're full of bureaucratic gunk.
That it makes it so hard for the people who actually need the help to get the help.
Yeah.
Right. And that wasn't how it was ever designed. But I wanted to finish with this from John Meacham, Searching Soul of America. Meacham's great. I don't know if I've said this enough on the podcast, but in his remarks at the library, Johnson, his hair a little longer, and this is, by the way, December the 12th, 1972, at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas. This is right towards the end of his life, so it's the last public appearance. In his remarks at the library, Johnson, his hair longer now, his frame more stooped, spoke of how far the country had come and how far it had to go. Progress has been much too small, he said. I'm kind of ashamed of myself that I had 6 years and couldn't do more. So let no one delude himself that the work is done. To be black or brown in white society is not to stand on equal ground. One person remarked that the fatigue of the night before seemed to drop away and the old adrenaline machine was pumping back into action. Johnson went back to center stage, if only for a moment, and said, let's try to get our folks reasoning together and reasoning with Congress and with the cabinet, reason with the leadership and with the president. And you don't need to start off by saying he is terrible because he doesn't think he's terrible. Start by talking about how you believe he wants to do what's right and how you believe this is right. And you'll be surprised how many more want to do what's right. We'll try to help you out. It was a word of pragmatic hope from a man who had seen the best and worst of a nation he knew was capable. However, the dark hour of doing the right thing. He had seen it. He had done it. And he died 3 weeks into the new year, believing it could always be done again.
Lyndon
Johnson. So we're going to be back with yet another episode on Lyndon Johnson. This one about how we think of Lyndon Johnson today.
Yes.
Which we've kind of hinted at throughout, right? We've thought about how it is, but let's actually get someone on that has a spreadsheet and statistical numbers for, where Johnson ranks in terms of top presidents in the history of the country, and also if his wife ever owned a pet lizard. And for that, we're going to turn over to my good friend, David Stumpfel, who I've had the incredible, insane privilege of working with for the last 3 years. But we'll bring you that next time. Bo, I think we have a little thing that we have to do here.
We have
to say that Civil War Trails is a proud sponsor of Homebrew History.
That's true.
Make some history of your own. I don't know. World's largest museum. Do it. See it. Be there.
Be square.
Finished up their season this year. They went out. They did their last couple sign installs at in Gettysburg. Actually, so that's kind of great. Just to see them out there expanding the museum one sign at a time.
They're coming for you.
Yeah. So that's always great, and we love to support our friends over at Civil War Trails. So remember to get out there, make some history of your own. You can like and follow them, and if you get out there and you do see a Civil War Trails marker sign, make sure to snap a signed selfie. Use that hashtag and tag them on Instagram or on Facebook, and maybe you end up being a part of their story altogether. So there's that to consider. But Bo, we have a little segment we're going to do.
We do.
I've been drinking from my very, very thematic cup the whole time.
Yes, so. It is a cornerstone piece of who we are, and tonight we did have to talk about Lyndon Johnson, which I imagine. You think he liked Elvis Presley?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. But when one king would see another, hopefully there's mutual, courtesies. But another king, I made a drink, and he kind of inspired. It's what I've seemingly come to call the peanut butter and jelly.
Is that jelly in the bottom of the glass?
It's strawberry preserves. Strawberry preserves.
How do you feel about this?
Oh, just wait. It's a Ponchatoula made strawberry whiskey and a little bit of that Screwball peanut butter whiskey on top. And that strawberry preserves, it just kind of gets in there with the alcohol, and it's actually pretty lovely.
I don't know about that one.
It's delicious. Delicious. Oh, put some hair on your chest. I mean, as you can see. Wait, that's Homebrew After Hours. Sorry. My bad.
Yeah. Keep your shirt on. That's for the OnlyFans version. Well, they pay us to keep our clothes on.
That's right.
Well,
I can tell you been sipping on this whole time.
Expose your chest on YouTube.
That's true.
You don't have to mark this as explicit.
That's true. Yeah, that's why. That's why.
Couple bucks going our way.
Yeah, we both have Venmo.
Tell that man to put his shirt back on.
Yes. Sweet Jesus.
Well, I mean, in case you were wondering, I named a concoction. I don't know how I don't have a name for it like you have a name for yours. So I'm just going to call it something I made. I'm drinking
something I made.
I put some ice, as one does. Pim's liqueur, because I need to use this bottle because I feel weird
throwing it.
I feel weird throwing it away.
Yeah.
I just don't want to keep like a third of a bottle of something.
Yeah.
Anyways, I put a little bit of Pim's, and then I got experimental. One of the things I got for Catherine and I, because today, the day that we're recording this, December the 19th, is Hattie, my daughter's birthday.
Yes, happy birthday, Miss Hattie.
She will remember this in posterity.
Yes. It'll be on YouTube for time immemorial.
But I got Catherine and I something because, it's her first birthday, but it's also kind of like a year of us being parents and not screwing this up.
Yes.
Big accomplishment. So Martinelli's has this cranberry apple sparkling cider. So I put a little bit of that in there with the Pims. And then I dropped a little bit of that lemon drop cocktail mixture in there. And then dropped in some maraschino cherries, a little bit of grenadine, mixed it up. Oh, it's been great. It's very frou-frou, but that's perfect.
That's perfect.
I love it.
It's perfect for my sweet little haunt.
And I'm thinking of summer right now in the dead of winter.
That's true. It was 75 degrees here yesterday.
It was not that here. But this has been Homebrew History. We are so glad that you've joined us for this series all on Lyndon Johnson and how we've come to see him as a domestic president in Vietnam. And we hope you'll stick around for part 4, where we get to talk a little bit about how he's been remembered.
Johnson, we've Johnson thrice.
We have Johnson thrice. We shall Johnson once more, I suppose. Is that okay to say? Can we Johnson? Does one Johnson?
Yeah, and I guess now that it's over, I guess we've Johnsoned.
It's not over yet.
Well, that's true. Well,
we have one more episode.
Roll the tape. Let's get out of here.
Roll tape. Let's go.